My parents told my sister she'd have to take care of them in old age since I couldn't afford it. They had no idea I already owned the retirement community they were planning to move into. Growing up, my sister Olivia was always the one my parents planned around. She was the accountant, married young to a man with a stable pension, living 20 minutes from our childhood home. I was the one who left for the city at 22 with a duffel bag and an unclear plan, working odd marketing jobs for years before quietly building a consulting business that, for a long time, my parents assumed was barely keeping me afloat. I never corrected that assumption. Partly because early on, it was almost true, and partly because by the time it stopped being true, my parents had already built an entire narrative around who I was, and correcting it felt exhausting in a way that wasn't worth the effort at every Thanksgiving dinner. The comment that changed things happened 3 years ago, at my mother's 70th birthday dinner. My father, in that offhand way he had of making enormous decisions sound casual, mentioned that as he and my mother got older, Olivia would probably need to take the lead on their care, since, in his words, she's the one with the stability for it. We can't exactly count on your sister for that kind of thing. Olivia, to her credit, looked uncomfortable. She'd never asked to be the default plan. But nobody, including me, said anything to correct him. I simply nodded, the way I'd learned to nod at comments like that for over a decade, and let the conversation move to dessert. What my father didn't know, what nobody in my family knew, was that 4 years earlier, my consulting business had grown into something significant enough that I'd started diversifying into commercial real estate, specifically senior living communities, an industry I'd fallen into almost by accident after a client project with a regional healthcare group. By the time my father made that comment at my mother's birthday, I held a majority ownership stake, through a holding company, in a well-regarded retirement community 40 minutes from my parents' house, one with a 2-year waiting list and a reputation, in that area, as the place everyone wanted to get into and almost nobody could afford. I hadn't planned this. Life has a strange sense of humor sometimes. 6 months after that birthday dinner, my mother mentioned, during a phone call, that she and my father had toured a beautiful retirement community and were hoping, eventually, to get on the waiting list, though the entry costs were steeper than they'd expected. She mentioned the name. I sat very still on the other end of that call for a moment, because I knew that name better than almost any property in my portfolio. I didn't tell her, not that day. I needed a moment to sit with what I now knew, the same way I imagine anyone would need a moment to process finding out their parents were trying to move into a building their unstable daughter quietly controlled. Over the following months, I watched, from a strange and slightly surreal distance, as my parents worked through the waiting list process, mentioning the cost concerns more than once, sometimes gently suggesting that Olivia and her husband might need to help out a bit if the numbers didn't work perfectly. Olivia, stretched already with her own mortgage and 2 kids in private school, grew quietly stressed about it, in the way people do when they're trying to be the responsible one without complaint. I let it play out a little longer than I probably should have, not out of cruelty, but because some part of me needed to see, clearly and without ambiguity, exactly how my family operated when they believed I wasn't a resource worth considering. The moment came at a small family dinner, 8 months after my mother's birthday, when my father, half joking but not entirely, said that if the retirement community costs stayed as high as projected, they might need to ask me for whatever I could manage, even if it wasn't much, since every little bit helps. I told him, calmly, the way I'd told difficult truths to difficult family members my entire adult life, that he wouldn't need to worry about the entry costs at all. He asked why, already bracing, I think, for some kind of small, symbolic contribution he could thank me for politely. Instead, I told him that I was the majority owner of the retirement community he and my mother had been trying to get into for the better part of a year, and that as majority owner, I had both the ability and the intention to ensure their unit costs were handled entirely, quietly, without any of the fanfare or family strain that had been building around the subject for months. The table went silent in that particular way tables go silent when a fact rearranges everyone's understanding of a person all at once. My mother asked me to repeat it. My father simply stared, the way people stare when a narrative they've held for 15 years quietly collapses in real time. Olivia, notably, was the first to laugh, a startled, relieved kind of laugh, before saying, "So I don't have to figure out how we're paying for this?" I told her no, she didn't, not because it was her responsibility to begin with, but because it had never actually been anyone's responsibility but mine to decide, and I was deciding it now, on my own terms, not because my father demanded it, but because I wanted to. My parents moved into that community 5 months later. I made sure, through the property management team, that they were treated exactly like any other resident, with no special mention of my ownership beyond what was necessary for the paperwork. My father has mentioned, more than once since, almost sheepishly, that he never really understood what my business actually did all those years. I've told him, gently, that he never really asked. Olivia and I are closer now than we've been in years, mostly because the invisible pressure that used to sit only on her shoulders finally dissolved into something we both quietly carry together, as equals, the way siblings probably should have all along. If you've ever been the family member quietly written off as unstable or not someone we can count on, while someone else was handed responsibilities they never asked for either, remember this, you don't owe anyone a public correction of their assumptions. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let the truth reveal itself, patiently, on your own terms, exactly when it matters most. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Silent Empire. New story every week, subscribe so you never miss one. See you in the next one.